Is the presentation on?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So let me start. So I'm going to talk about some challenges in designing a quantum-safe KEM and discuss the case study of BIKE. And this is a joint work with several collaborators that I will now mention. So I would say slide number 2 is the most important slide of this whole talk. And so I'll present myself. I'm a professor of mathematics at the University of Haifa, and I'm also a senior principal engineer for cryptography at AWS. And my colleagues are Nir Drucker, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Haifa, and he's a senior applied scientist at AWS. Dusan Kostic, who is a PhD candidate at EPFL, Switzerland, and he is also an applied scientist in cryptography at AWS. And Eduardo Persichetti, who is an assistant professor at Florida Atlantic University. So I'm going to discuss the story of the long and treacherous journey from IND-CPA security to IND-CCA security. So you see here the picture of the calm waters of IND-CPA security, and once you cross to IND-CCA security, things are completely different. And so I'll start with what is BIKE. So BIKE stands for bit flipping key encapsulation, and it's a QCM-DPC code-based KEM. It is one of the round 2 candidates for the NIST post-quantum crypto standardization project. There are 15 submitters, 14 were in round 1, and 1 was added in round 2, and you have the names here. There is an official website. And this talk is going to discuss the submission of the spec from February 2020, and by now there are some fixes and improvements in the latest spec from a few days ago. So let me just say just a few words about what BIKE round 1 was. So there were 3 schemes, BIKE 1, BIKE 2, and BIKE 3, based on different paradigms: McLeese, Niederreiter, and Ouroboros. And they present different trade-offs. And for example, for the communication bandwidth is 2R for BIKE 1. R is the block size, which is based on McLeese. And BIKE 2 that is based on Niederreiter has only R, half of this. But this is a trade-off because the Niederreiter framework requires a polynomial inversion for the key generation. And this is especially painful when we want to have ephemeral keys and regenerate keys for every session. So we had 3 schemes and 3 security levels, 1, 3, and 5. And the design was completely IND-CPA design. This was the claim. And the intention was to use it with ephemeral keys, a new public-private key pair for every session. And the recommended block size was 10,163 bits. We measure in bits because the number in bits needs to be prime and satisfy some other constraints. But if you divide it by 8, you see how much it is approximately in bytes. And this is the traffic cost for BIKE 1 is 2R. Now the failure rate of this scheme in this design was 10 to the minus 7. This is 2 to the minus 23. And what we can say is that this is tolerable by a real system. And real system, actually, we made experiments on this in production testing in AWS S2N. This is the equivalent of the libSSL for AWS. So this was the original design. Now in BIKE round 2, there are still 3 schemes, BIKE 1, BIKE 2, BIKE 3, but now 2 variants. There is an IND-CPA version and also an IND-CCA version. Still the same 3 security levels, so you can do the multiplication. And the new feature was that we have introduced the variants for IND-CCA security. So they are called BIKE 1, CCA, and so forth. They come with an IND-CCA security claim. So the claims, the additional claims were positioned as due to a new decoder called Backflip decoder that has a failure rate of 2 to the minus 128. I'll refer to level 1, but for level 3, for example, the failure rate needs to be 2 to the minus 192. So the block size is now larger. If you remember, instead of 10,163, it's now 11,779. So there is a new decoder, a new block size, and the third ingredient is Fujisaki Okamoto implicit rejection transform. We call from a paper in 2017, and the proof of the IND-CCA security for BIKE relies on the proof in that paper. And what I can say is that now IND-CCA is heavy lifting, and I'll try to explain why. So I have this IND-CPA security is very calm, very easy to satisfy. IND-CCA security is something completely different. So what is the difference? Now the adversary has access to a decapsulation oracle, and you can fix the key pair, and you need to allow as many queries, decapsulation queries as the adversary wishes. And now the scheme needs to address reaction attacks. So it's not only that the adversary should not be able to learn anything from active attacks, but he should not be able to learn anything from knowing if a query caused a decapsulation failure or not. And this is the challenge. So now things are completely different. So in IND-CPA security, failures are system tolerable measure. So whatever you can tolerate in your system. But in IND-CCA, the failure rate are a critical security ingredient of the scheme. And this is the big difference. So so who actually requires IND-CCA security for KEMs? Is it absolutely required, or can we live with IND-CPA security? So basically, if our goal is to satisfy forward secrecy, then independently we want to change the keys for every session. So in that situation, IND-CPA security suffices. And I just bring a quote from a new proposed spec for hybrid TLS. And there is some statement about what is actually required. So if you can see, IND-CCA security is desirable, but it is not absolutely mandatory, and it suffices that there are some protection mechanisms through the Fujisaki Okamoto transform or the variation of HHK. So it is a desirable feature, but it's not absolutely mandatory. Well, we still want to have this feature, right? So the problem is that it is very subtle to use the HHK 2017 for paper for IND-CCA when the decapsulation has non-zero probability to fail. And that's the main problem. So let's start with a good decoder with a very low DFR. This is the necessary condition. So BIKE Round 2 introduced the Backflip decoder. There is a claim that it has a DFR of 2 to the minus 128. And here is the question, is it so easy to actually make this claim? The other claim is that as a result, the BIKE CCA flows with the Fujisaki Okamoto transform give an IND-CCA secure KEM. And here is another question, is this so easy to satisfy? Now the spec actually states that the HHK proof applies to this deduction, but there are not enough details on how this applies, and there are not sufficient details on how the DFR was actually computed for the Backflip decoder, but there is a reference to a paper from BIKE 2019, but even this paper includes only a rough description of the method. So I will explain the methodology, the main idea of this BIKE 2019 by Sandrier and Vasser, how they achieve a decoder with a very low DFR. So first thing, So the problem is that you cannot check the DFR, because if the DFR is 2 to the minus 128, you will never see a failure. So the idea is to calculate the DFR on small block size, small R values. And for these small values, you do randomized testing. And with the small number, you expect to see enough errors, and you estimate the failure rate for these values. And now you take the measurements that you have from the experiments and you extrapolate the DFR to a larger R value, this value of interest, and you just extrapolate to the estimated DFR, to the desirable DFR, and then you say you can determine what is the block size for which the extrapolation curve hits the 2 to the minus 128 or whatever target DFR you wish to achieve. But the extrapolation, of course, is under some assumption. It may be reasonable assumption, but it's an assumption on how the DFR depends on the value R. In the paper by Neil Drucker, myself, and Dusan Kostic from 2019, we show that there are different ways to perform these extrapolations. For example, linear regression of the set of points. So regardless of the points that you collected, there are different ways to interpret the results. So one is linear regression. The other one is a quadratic fit to the set of points. And there is another one, like you connect the two last points, or the largest points that you can achieve. This is what we assumed the method for the BIKE Crypto 2019 paper. But then, of course, in this case, the results depends on the choice of these two last points, and maybe on an assumption that the function is concave, and then you can say that every 2 points, if you shoot the linear extrapolation from every 2 points, you will get an upper bound for the DFR. So what is the dependency? Actually, the results depend on the level of accuracy that you have for the estimations for small r. And to trust these estimations, you also need to depend on the quality of the small points, so the experiments and the confidence level you have on the actual data that is collected. Plus, you need to trust the assumption on the extrapolation. And actually, in this paper, we show that the experimental evidence that the methodology is self-consistent. So we just did experiments for some points and checked for whatever R values we could really do a simulation, that this gives a good approximation. All right, so now what we know is that if you get more confidence in the collected points, then you get more confidence in the pointwise results. But this requires many samples for every point. And many, I mean billions of samples for every point. And especially this is becoming more and more comprehensive, or more and more billions as when you get the large values, because with large values, you are supposed to see less decoding failures. So you need to do many billions until you see enough of them so that you can get some statistics on the result. Now, if you have more confidence in the pointwise results, then you have more confidence in the extrapolated data under the assumption that the dependence of DFR on the R is whatever you assume. Now let's see a problem with the decoder, the Backflip decoder. So here is a snapshot of the specification, and I will not get to the details, but let me point to you what is missing here. What's missing here is that the number of steps in this decoder is not specified. And here it is, there is a while. You don't know a priori if this is not defined. How many steps are there? Independently, there is a typo here, but this is immaterial, but this needs to be flipped. So here is the problem. You have a decoder, and the number of steps is not specified. How many steps? We don't know. So here is the question, a basic question. You have a cryptographic primitive with a variable number of steps. So is it possible to do this if this number of steps depends on the secret input? The input is secret. So is this number unlimited? And if it is variable, can you implement this decoder in constant time? So let's say in general, you have a standard approach for algorithms that have with an a priori unknown number of steps. How do you do this? You put a cap on the number of steps and you declare a failure if this cap is reached. But this introduced new failure events, and these affect the overall system. But for a decoder in an IND-CCA KM, the DFR is actually the essential ingredient in the security analysis. So adding a cap on an algorithm that a priori doesn't have a limit on the number of steps actually changes the DFR. And this was not included in the analysis. So there is a basic problem of an algorithm that doesn't have a specified number of steps. So how many steps actually? Of course, the DFR depends on the number of iterations that you allow. Iterations and steps, I use these interchangeably. And for example, okay, if you set the decoder to always return failure after one iteration, you get 100% failure rate. Now, a constant time decoder must perform all of the iterations. So you cannot do an at most approach, at most 100 steps, at most 10 steps. You have to always do all of them. But there was no specific definition for the number of iterations in the Backflip decoder. If you dig inside the reference code, okay, there is a limit of 100 as a cap, but no motivation or explanation. But let's say that this is the cap. And then the question is, what happens if you just execute exactly 100 iterations? Now you get a completely impractical decoder. So the Backflip decoder with a specific number of iterations that are always executed, for example, X Backflip equals 100 is what we call Backflip plus. And we can study this. Now this becomes, so with exactly 100 iterations, it is impractical, and even less practical if you are making all of the iterations constant time and you execute them, all of them, always. So now, so what is the bottom line? The decoder must be defined with a constant number of steps. And you must show, at least argue the feasibility of a constant time implementation. And now there is a question of efficiency. So how do we check if something is efficient or not after we fix the number of steps? So you accept or determine some extrapolation methodology, and you parameterize the decoder per this number of steps, and you also keep an account of the cost per step or per iteration. And then you ask yourself, what is the smallest block size where the estimated DFR hits the target? Our target is, for example, 2 to the minus 128. And now, how many steps do you need? So this binds back to the performance. And altogether, you want to find the most appealing block size versus performance trade-off for a decoder. And this is true for any decoder, including the Backflip plus decoder. So now the question, is this the most appealing option to get the target DFR? So that's the next question. So now we go to, we will study this, I think, later. And now let's go to another question. Does a good decoder guarantee IND-CCA? So let's say that you have the Fujisaki-Okamoto transform that converts an IND-CPA PKE to an IND-CCA KM, and the BIKE spec actually says that defines that a DFR, the decoding failure rate, is the probability that the decoder fails with a uniformly distributed input of the secret key and the error, and also that the resulting KM will have the exact same DFR as the underlying crypto system. Okay, so there are two assumptions: that the decoder's DFR and the delta correctness property of the HHK proof are the same thing, and therefore that having a decoder with this DFR guarantees IND-CCA security. Now, are these two things the same? The DFR and the delta. So they are not the same unless you have a proof for that. And it is not clear how to leverage the HHK paper over BIKE designs, especially for BIKE 2 and BIKE 3 to do this. So these are two difficulties that still remain. So what's now? I'm going to show like a small slide on what BIKE 2 looks like. So you have some key generation, you have an encapsulation and decapsulation, and these follow the actually Niederreiter scheme. So you can see that there is inversion in key generation, but the costly inversion actually decreases the communication bandwidth. And the decoder, if you see here, the decoder may fail with some probability, and DFR is the failure rate. So that's the basic scheme. Now, what's important here is how the shared key is derived. So the underlying PKE has the errors as the randomness, and the shared key is derived from that randomness. So you see here how the shared key, the red K, is derived. But if you do this, it is not clear how you can leverage the HHK theorem, because this is not how the proof goes. So in a new paper, and this is Drucker, myself, Kostic, and Eduardo Persichetti, on the applicability of the Fujisaki-Okamoto transform for the BIKE KEMs, actually, we made a small fix. So the small fix is to get the same, almost the same flow, but a slightly different definition where we derive the shared key from the message. And before it was from the errors which were the randomness, and now it is derived from the message. So now, if you do this slight change in the flow, in the definition, now you can completely apply the HHK proof. Of course, there needs to be a proof for some property that I'll discuss in a minute. The nice thing is, as a bonus, this is also more efficient because it is more efficient to hash or to compute the derivation from M prime, where M prime is only 256 bits, than what it was before. So this is the basic idea. So how does it go? The proof goes through a notion that we call a message agnostic PKE, where the decryption failures are independent of the encrypted message. And with this slight modification for BIKE 2 and also for BIKE 3, for BIKE 1 there was no modification needed, we can show that all the underlying PKEs for BIKE versions are message agnostic. And this is good news, because this implies the result that we really wanted, that if BIKE is instantiated with a decoder decode, and the decoder has a DFR of 2 to the minus 128, and it can be implemented in constant time, I should say, it also is demonstrated to be implemented, but at least you can argue that it can be implemented in constant time. And there is also that the probability of decoding success, but the decryption failure, that this is negligible. So if you have all these, then BIKE is an IND-CCA key encapsulation mechanism. And this closes the gap. Of course, we need to show if there is such a decoder. But at least this closes the theoretical gap. So with this, we just go to the extrapolation method challenges. How about weak keys? So here is the question in the extrapolation. Do the simulations, even for small r, do they necessarily capture rare anomalies? And this is not trivial to answer. And actually in the paper from 2019, we show that there is a large set of keys where decoding failure is large or larger than other keys. Now the Good news is that the relative size of this set of weak keys is still small enough. So it was not a counterexample, but it was something that indicates that one should be careful about these extrapolations. At the very least, do them very, very intensively, because it is not clear that every anomaly is captured through these simulations, even if they are done on a small block size. But I should just say that there are other indications that show that the extrapolations are self-consistent. So if you believe some kind of a methodology, at least it is self-consistent. Now let's talk about the extrapolation method. In the end, there is a very good indication for the estimated DFR, that this is a good indication. There are different estimation methods. So we can take the most conservative, or we can take the one that seems most agreeable. Now, the confidence can always be improved by doing more experiments, and I'm talking billions and billions, and this is what we've been doing. But there is no escape from the fact that you must rely in the end on some assumption on how the DFR depends on the block size R. Now, these assumptions are reasonable, but they still does not constitute a formal proof. So in the end, what we have in this study, in the 2019 study, is the question about a crypto primitive with a variable number of steps. It is fixed through setting the number of iterations for backflip. So we call it backflip plus decoder, and study from a very small to up to 100, and we'll run a full study. But then the surprise is that backflip plus is not really the most efficient decoder that we can come up with. So there is another decoder, the black-gray decoder, that is more efficient than the backflip if you compare all constant time implementations. So the methodology that I described applies to any decoder, and it turns out that there are better decoders, and now this was the decoder that was used, at least for the additional implementation of BIKE. Now there is another warning sign. The extrapolation does not necessarily capture anomalies, so we need to be careful about the statement on the estimations. Different extrapolation methods can give different DFR estimations. And they recommend, here is an example for what happened. The BIKE's recommended parameter in the spec was 11,779, but it turns out to be too small to get the DFR of 2 to the minus 128, even based on the extrapolations. And instead, this paper suggested 12,781. In a subsequent paper, we actually found out that there is an even more efficient decoder, we call it black-gray flip, that is identified, and now you have a suggested block size value of 12,539, but it is more efficient in terms of performance in constant time. In 2020, there was one more step. That if you're willing to make the small change in the flows of BIKE 2 and BIKE 3, then all of them become an IND-CCA secure, or actually this closes the gap between DFR and delta correctness, and they become IND-CCA secure if you really have a decoder with a proven DFR of 2 to the 128. So where are we now? For IND-CCA security, we know that BIKE with a decoder with proven DFR of this magnitude is IND-CCA secure. There are efficient decoders, BGF, black-gray flip, with this estimated DFR for level 1 and for level 3. And to get this, the recommended size of the block size is around 12,500 bits. But this, of course, depends on trusting the estimations, of course. If this this is goes. So there is no formal IND-CCA claim with the BGF or with any decoder that we are aware of, but there is positive indication in favor of accepting these estimations. The recommendation was and still is to use ephemeral keys because the forward secrecy property is what you really want, and not a fixed key. And for ephemeral keys, says, and there is no problem with ephemeral keys. Now, say this again. Finally, a new thing was an official polynomial inversion, actually, that allows for using the neither writer and save 50% of the bandwidth. So this is a new thing, and now further optimization actually indicate that that the R value needs not only be prime and also that satisfies some irreducibility property, but also it is good if the weight of R minus 2 is small. For example, 12,323 in base 2, you can see that it has only a few set bits. So this is a further optimization that you want to pursue. And this actually leads to the new BIKE spec. So the new BIKE step consolidates all of the BIKE into a single variant, actually. There is only one BIKE right now. It comes with two flavors, level 1 and level 3 parameters, but they are the same flows. It uses the neither writer framework. The communication bandwidth for every direction is 1.5 kilobyte only. There is a solid constant time performance for additional code. And here are the results. So key generation is 470 kilocycles, encapsulation is 192, and decapsulation is 1.3 million cycles. So encapsulation, I remind, is what's done in the responding party, and the initiating party is doing the keygen and the decapsulation. And then you see the ratio, and you see that the key generation is now relatively small compared to the decapsulation, and this is why this is due to the fast inversion, and it buys the 50% reduction. So this is you have the details on what platform this was measured on, and I conclude with this that the BIKE is the best thing since sliced bread. And
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shay.